Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. We are so glad to have all of you here tonight, what we're considering the kickoff to our Alumni Weekend. I'm Cleve Hill, a member of the class of 2001, and proud to serve on the Board of Trustees. Tonight's topic, of course, as you I'm sure all aware from the mailings and signing up to get you here tonight, our title is Principal Moments, the Leadership Lessons of Charles Longstreet Weltner, class of 48. 14 years after the midway point of the 20th century, and 12 years short of the 200th anniversary of the Venerable Declaration of Independence, which declared all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the United States was coming apart at its very seams, haunted by the practical emptiness of the words in the Declaration, and bedeviled by the ghost of our past. Men and women, boys and girls were being denied equal opportunities, being denied education, were being spat upon, segregated, cursed, beaten, tortured, and murdered. The late Coretta Scott King said it very well. The cause of human dignity demanded change. The question was, would our leaders, especially in the Deep South, pick up the banner of the cause of human dignity? At 10 a.m. on July the 2nd, 1964, a call was placed from Atlanta, the undisputed mother church of the civil rights movement. The call was placed by a father to his son in Washington, D.C. to ask him about his day ahead. It sounds mundane until you hear the story. Nothing could be more untruthful than to call this telephone call in that day mundane. This was no ordinary father and son, and it was no ordinary day. The father said to the son, "I suppose the resolute has made his decision. I'm going to vote for it," said the son. "You're on the side of history. I'm proud of you," intoned the father. As you might have assumed from tonight's program, the father was Dr. Philip Weltner, the former chancellor of the University System of Georgia and the president of Oglethorpe University for 9 years. The son was Congressman Charles Longstreet Weltner, Oglethorpe University Alumnus class of 1948. The "it" to which the congressman referred was unquestionably one of the landmark, monumental pieces of legislation in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act explicitly outlawed segregation in public places and public schools. It strengthened voting rights protections. It prohibited discrimination by employers and established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Born December 17, 1927, Charles Weltner was the son of Philip Weltner and Sally Hull Weltner, and was the great-great-grandson of Joseph Henry Lumpkin, the first Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. He graduated from this institution as a 16-year-old young man in 1948 and proceeded to Columbia University, where he received his law degree. He then served 2 years in the U.S. Army and practiced law in Atlanta for a decade before being elected as the congressman from Georgia's 5th Congressional District, which included Atlanta. Weltner was elected in the tumultuous hotbed of the 1960s, but he wasn't one to shy away from hard situations, tedious work. His commencement speech here at Oglethorpe University in 1963 gave those members of the graduating class and those in attendance a bit of insight into his work ethic. He quoted from Longfellow's The Ladder of St. Augustine, and he said, "Heights that great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night." The path to the final version of the Civil Rights Act of '64 was fraught with peril and politics at every turn. Weltner later said the goal of equal rights was something I had long ago accepted and found in accord with my understanding of the Constitution and my basic religious beliefs. And it was the course of history. The question was whether I could or would make that belief a matter of record at the time on that bill under those circumstances. But on July 2nd, 1964, an astonished United States House of Representatives watched as that 36-year-old man, a proud son of this institution, stood to his feet and voted in favor of the act. While the measure would have passed without his vote was remarkable because he was the only congressman from the Deep South to vote for its passage. He understood that bold leadership was necessary to guide the South and the nation out of its divisive, agonizing past. Speaking from the well of the House that day, he said, "We must not remain forever bound to another lost cause." Facing re-election in 1966 and forced by his state's political party to sign a loyalty oath to the party's segregationist nominee for governor, the young congressman again stood on his convictions and resigned his re-election bid, stating, "I love Congress, but I will give up my seat before I give up my principles." Ending his national political career, Weltner returned home to Georgia to practice law. He later became a Superior Court judge and later served, as his great-great-grandfather had, as Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. For his acts of political courage, in 1992, he was awarded the second John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. While Weltner's life and career surely were more than just these two events, as we approach the 50th anniversary of the passage of this bill, we should observe and emulate the character of this proud son of Oglethorpe as we face decisions large and small, and in our treatment of our fellow man. Writing about his experiences after he left Congress, Weltner wrote, and I hope you'll allow me to read this quote. "Our fundamental character declares all men created equal. Our basic religion declares us our brother's keeper. But the demand for justice rests not alone on legal precept or theological tenet. It is a demand that spans creed and clan, age and continent. It speaks now as it has to the prophet, saint, and patriot, and to unnumbered millions of men and women throughout all time. It wells up from the heart as plain truth and clear duty. Let right be done." Tonight we welcome another proud, courageous Georgia leader and fellow Profile in Courage recipient, Governor Roy Barnes, whom my friend Austin Gillis will now welcome.
Well, thank you, Cleve. My name is Austin Gillis. I am the president of the Alumni Board here at Oglethorpe, and I want to take another moment just to welcome everybody here tonight. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Governor Roy Barnes. If you go to Governor Barnes's website, the very first thing you'll see, before discussions of his accomplishments in government or his many awards and honors, the very first thing you'll see is that he is described as a lawyer's lawyer. And as an attorney practicing in Cobb County, I can confirm that this is most certainly the case. Governor Barnes has a very impressive knowledge of the law and a great command of the courtroom. It is always a pleasure to watch him in action, even when you are on the other side. I don't think that I've ever been so nervous in my life as the day that I had to sit in the witness chair and be cross-examined by Governor Barnes. It was through some strange circumstances that I found myself, rather than at counsel table, being on the witness stand. But Governor Barnes treated me with respect. And he did his job very well, but the proceedings were always dignified. And that's just the kind of man that Governor Barnes is. And as dignified as he is, he would probably be embarrassed for me to talk about his many honors and recognitions, but I'm going to do it anyway. He is the recipient of the Georgia Trend 2002 Award for Georgian of the Year. He is a recipient of the UGA School of Law Distinguished Service Scroll Award. He is a recipient of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation's Weltner Award, which is the award that is named after Justice Weltner, whom we are honoring today. And as Cleve mentioned, Governor Barnes was the 2003 winner of the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award, which is the same award that Justice Weltner himself won in 1991. As Governor of Georgia, Governor Barnes helped carry the mantle of leadership and justice in this state, as Charles Weltner had when he was serving as a congressman. And so it is with great pleasure that I give you our keynote speaker, the 80th Governor of Georgia, Roy Barnes.
I appreciate so much you inviting me to come and visit with you, and particularly talk tonight about a time that is past, or is it past, in the state of Georgia. You know, the shelf life of a former governor is about 15 minutes. So whenever I can get something free to eat and have a good crowd, I will be there on every occasion. You know, I always tell young aspiring politicians, particularly those who have just gotten elected, don't take yourself too seriously, you know. You could drop dead and probably be a week before your constituents knew that you were dead. I've got to tell you a little story. I love baseball, and I love Braves baseball. Had season tickets for years and years and years, and still do. And even back when they were, you know, losing terribly by the third inning in the 70s and the 80s. If you had any extra tickets, you know, you could put them on your windshield. There'd be 4 extra tickets. You could come back and there'd be 8 there. And so they improved greatly, you know, and so we had those glory years. And so after I was elected governor, I kept there's 4 of us that were in a pot buying season tickets, so I kept my share of the tickets. Governor has a place down there on the front. You see the governor from time to time sitting down with Ted Turner or some of those. But you can't watch a ball game. Somebody's coming up to you all the time wanting to talk. So I just kept my seats. And one night, Mary, my wife, and Alyssa, our youngest daughter, and a trooper in plain clothes went to the baseball game. It was right after I was elected, in the first spring after I'd taken office. And we sat down to watch the game. And you know how it is when you have season tickets, you kind of have a nodding acquaintance with everybody around you. Congratulations, you know, and thank you. So we sat down and watched the game. The folks that generally sat and had the season tickets right in front of us were not there that night. And so about the third inning, a few of the good old boys drinking a little beer, they slipped in from up above down in front of us, which was all right with me, you know. But we were playing the Florida Marlins that night, and there was this obnoxious Florida Marlins fan behind us, you know, who screamed out at the most inappropriate time, you know, every time the Marlins got a hit. And so the boys in front, you know, they would quieten him down in their own language. And when they turn around, you know, one of them would look at me, and he knew me from someplace, but he couldn't quite put together where he was he knew me from. And then about the 5th inning, it was like a light bulb came on in his head. And he turned around and he says, "Hey, buddy," he says, "do you work down at the Ford plant?" I told him, I said, "No, but I drive a Ford." I want to talk tonight not only about Charles Weltner, who, if you had to pick 5 of the most outstanding people who lived in the 20th century from the state of Georgia, would be at the top of that list. And as Cleve said, that Dr. Philip Weltner told him, you're on the right side of history, and in fact, he was. But this has been, in preparing my remarks tonight, this has been very cathartic for me because it allowed me to look back to where I was in 1964 and remember back at the circumstances of the state of Georgia in 1964. I was 16 years old, more interested in driving a car than anything else, you know. But I was 16 years old, and in Cobb County, it was in the midst of the discussion, even though Brown versus Topeka had been in 1954, and it was 12 years later, whether Cobb County was going to integrate the public schools of Cobb County. It was not only a raging controversy in Cobb County, it was a raging controversy in the state. Governor Ernie Vandiver had been governor until 1961, and in the 1963, and in the 1962 election, this young fella beat by the name of Carl Sanders defeated Marvin Griffin, who was an arch segregationist. I talked to Governor Vandiver about this, but the controversy was, are we going to close, if you can believe this debate occurred, are we going to close the public schools of the state of Georgia, as in Maryland and some of the other places, Prince George County, they had done, rather than to integrate the public schools? When I used to tell my children about, I remember a time of separate water fountains, separate schools, they would think that I was telling them some fairy tale, like I read out of a book. But it was there. And Governor Vandiver and the whole controversy, the General Assembly, by the way, was overwhelmingly in favor of closing the public school. And if it had been left up to those hotheads, we would have closed the public schools at the time. Governor Vandiver very wisely created the Sibley Commission. Some of you remember this, not many. But Judge Sibley, appointed Judge Sibley, who was a distinguished jurist, members of the General Assembly. By the way, Carl Sanders was one of the members before he was elected governor. And leaders in the General Assembly, leaders out in the state, to hold hearings around the state and to decide whether the University system of Georgia would be closed rather than to accept integration. By the way, Governor Vandiver told me later that the vote was by one vote to close the university system. And he says, when they came and told me, it was not done publicly, he said, I worked the commission and pushed them, even though they were supposed to be giving advice to me. I knew that you could not close the university system. And the Sibley Commission recommended that the university system not be closed. And then in 1964, in the midst of Carl Sanders' term, and in the fervor of, remember, John Kennedy had been killed, assassinated, which was, everybody of my generation remembers where they were when Jack Kennedy was killed. And for some of us, it was the reason, Jack Kennedy was the reason that we had an interest in politics. Jack Kennedy had been killed in November of the previous year. And Lyndon Johnson, this Southerner, decided that he would make civil rights his shining moment. Now, I don't know any of you have done this, but if you go to the LBJ library, and they have released all of the tapes now. Of course, Johnson taped everybody just like Nixon did. And, I mean, you know, they all taped them, you know. But go to 1964, the spring and early summer of '64, when the Civil Rights Act was being considered. And listen to those tapes. Richard Russell from Georgia, who was the leader of the opposition in the United States Senate, was the mentor to Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson has one conversation with him. He says, "Dick, you're on the wrong side of civil rights." And Russell says, "Mr. President, I'm on the right side. You can't destroy our institutions. You know that, you're a Southerner." And Johnson says, "Dick, I'm going to pass this bill. Now either get out of the way or I'm going to run over you." And in fact, that's what happened in the end. And in that context, we have there were 7 Southerners who voted for the Civil Rights Bill, only 1 from the Deep South. You know, we never have considered Maryland and, you know, all that. And only 1 voted in favor of it, and that was Charles Weltner, Congressman Charles Weltner. The first time the bill came, he voted against it. And then when the bill went to the Senate and came back, he gave the speech that Cleve has referred to and voted for it, and it shocked the South. He was asked later, what changed you? He said, "My conscience changed me, but here was the event that so infuriated me." You remember at this time that 4 little girls were killed in a bombing in Birmingham, Alabama on a Sunday morning, and the only thing they were doing was going to church and had the misfortune to be black. And Weltner said, not one Southerner stood up and said that was wrong. Not one Southerner stood up and said, "What kind of men are these?" And Weltner spoke about it on the floor of the House and chastised his fellow Southerners about it. And it really was the change of Charles Weltner that led him to a place of greatness. You know, if we look at the changes that have occurred since he made that courageous stand. Russell later said that they could have beaten Kennedy on the Civil Rights Act. But Russell said, "Lyndon Johnson will jerk your arm out of the socket and beat you over the head." What if the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act had never passed? What kind of bloodshed would we have had in the South? What kind of place would we be here today? But this is the question that I want to posit to right now. Could the Civil Rights Act of 1964 get through the Congress of the United States today? And I suggest to you that it could not. You know, one of the great heroes, besides Weltner, who made his Southerners who knew that it was wrong, what was happening to African Americans in the South. He gave them a conscience. And in fact, Al Gore Sr. had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, though he voted for the Civil Rights Act of the Voting Rights Act of 65, and he later said the vote against the 64 Civil Rights Act was the worst mistake he'd ever made in political history. It was Charles Weltner who gave the conscience to people like Al Gore to say, I can't, this is not right. Something has to be done. One of the other great heroes was Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate. Had it not been for Dirksen, because the Democrats like Richard Russell, the Southern Democrats, were fighting him. Only one, by the way, in the Senate, only one Southerner in the Senate voted for the bill, and it was Ralph Yarborough of Texas. And the question is, would there be another Everett Dirksen? Johnson calls Dirksen. They were great friends. And Dirksen would stay in, even though one was a majority leader, one was a minority leader in the Senate, and then Johnson became president. And they were great friends, and you can tell that by listening to the telephone conversation. And Johnson calls Dirksen. He said, I can't pass this unless you deliver me 27 votes. And he delivered those votes. He delivered those votes. Would there be that type of cooperation to be able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 today? They can't even sit in the same room, much less take something as controversial as the Civil Rights Act and pass it, knowing that it was going to cause political losses. Johnson told Bill Marius when he signed the bill, we've just given the Republicans the South for a generation. I'd be satisfied with one generation. Because that's over with. But I want to tell you, this gets back, and then I'm going to hush and answer a few questions that you have. This gets back to this question that I'm often asked by high school students. Students, and the younger they are, the more this is true, have no compulsion whatsoever about what they ask you. I mean, they will straight out ask you anything. But one of the questions that I spoke at a high school yesterday over in western part of Cobb County, and I got this question. Does politics really matter? Does it matter who's elected? Aren't they all the same? Aren't they just a bunch of crooks? I mean, everybody is just different levels of crooks. Does leadership, what they're saying is, does leadership make a difference? Well, I want to tell you, we already know that in the case of Charles Weltner, it made a difference. Leadership made a difference in framing and making the South that we enjoy today by prosperity. But I want to go back and pick up that young governor from Georgia that had been elected at the same time, Carl Sanders. Carl Sanders was elected in 1962 in Georgia. He was the first of our New South governors. And they had an election in 1962 in Alabama, as you remember. And the South was, and who did they elect then? George Wallace. And the South had begun to grow. And the conventional wisdom was that the South was going to be the new industrial and manufacturing center of the state, of the nation. And in fact, it has become so. There was great debate, however, as to which city and which state was going to emerge as a great capital of this new South. Some thought it was going to be Charlotte, North Carolina, and some thought it was going to be Jacksonville, Florida. With the conventional wisdom, it was going to be Birmingham, Alabama. And why? Why would Birmingham, besides being a little more centrally located? Birmingham had a jump start on the manufacturing. Steel mills. When I was a kid in the 50s, there were people living in my community that their daddies went to Birmingham every week and stayed there to work in the steel mills and the jobs that were there, and came home on the weekend. They had the steel mills, and the only place in the South where there was a mass of industry was Birmingham. And in fact, I'll give you this statistic. In 1960, the metropolitan area of Birmingham, Alabama, and Atlanta, Georgia was almost equal. Almost equal. Atlanta was not this big 5.5 million people center. And in Alabama, when they had that governor's race, they elected George Wallace. And a few weeks after he was elected, he had his inauguration, and in his inaugural speech, he gave one of the most famous lines in political rhetoric even to this day. I know not what you and your house will do, but for me and my house, I will draw a line in the sand. I will cast the gauntlet down, and I will say to you, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And the crowd roared with approval, because there were no African Americans, or very few. This was before the Voting Rights Act. And a few weeks later, George Wallace appeared on the cover of Time magazine as being the emerging leader of the South. Now remember that Carl Sanders fellow? The first 6 months that he was governor, he ran around the state and he said, we may not agree with the decisions of the Supreme Court, but we're Americans and we will obey them. In fact, his most famous line was, I'm a segregationist, but I'm not a damn fool. And then that event occurred in Birmingham a few months after George Wallace had got excited everyone to a frenzy, and 4 little girls were killed on that Sunday morning. And business did what it always does. It seeks stability, it seeks safety, and it seeks security. And business came to Atlanta, Georgia, where they had Charles Weltner, Ivan Allen, and Carl Sanders. So when you go back home, we may fuss about about the traffic, but you see those skyscrapers that now line the interstate and that have given us prosperity beyond any of our imagination as a child. You remember, leadership matters. Leadership matters. And but for Charles Longstreet Weltner, whose grandfather wrote the Confederate Constitution, and but for Carl Sanders and Ivan Allen, we would be Birmingham, Alabama today. Thank you. God bless you.